Welcome to Scrolling to Death. I'm Nikki, and today I have data scientist and psychologist Dr. Gloria Mark with me. Welcome, Dr. Mark.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to speak with you. So we know we're living in a time where distractions rule our lives and make it difficult to maintain focus, to get things done, even to develop relationships at times. And this is particularly true of our youth, of our kids. So I would love it if we could talk today about what's going on with our children's attention spans and how we can best support our kids as they develop.
Yeah.
So So first, what are adolescent attention spans looking like today? How have they changed since introducing smartphones and screen-based childhoods?
Yeah. So let's talk about adult attention spans.
Okay.
And adult attention spans have declined over the last 20 years. So I have been tracking this. I use objective measurements as opposed to self reports.
Mm-hmm.
So I use computer logging, I use sensors so that we can get exact measures of how long people are on each screen. Back in 2023, 24, I'm sorry, 2003, 2004,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when we first started studying this, people's attention averaged about 2.5 minutes on any screen before
Mm-hmm.
switching, which astonished me at the time. And in the last, 5, 6 years, we find that they average 47 seconds on a screen.
Wow.
It's not just my work; others have replicated this. A lot has happened in the last 20 years, right? The smartphone was invented
Mm-hmm.
in 2007. Uh, Facebook just exploded. It started around 2003 for the public.
Mm-hmm.
Twitter came about, TikTok, that's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and e-commerce just exploded. So all these things came about that are just competing for our attention.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, our attention spans have shrunk over the
Okay.
years.
Adults and children as well, you would say.
Well, I have not measured children's
Okay.
attention spans.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I would guess that they have also shortened based on speaking with a lot of teachers, with a lot of parents, but I cannot give you a statistic for how long their attention spans
That's fine. Okay. So you have a wonderful book called Attention Span. It's here. I read it. I learned so much. There's just so much packed into this one book. The one thing that I wanted to touch on that really caught my eye was the topic of rote activities. And I think it's helpful
are.
for parents to understand what this is. So first, can you describe to listeners what is a rote activity?
Okay. So, what I mean by a rote activity is when we do something that we're really engaged in doing and it's not challenging for us. So, let me contrast that with being focused. So, when kids are at school, they have to listen to the teacher, or if they're reading something in a book or they're doing math problems, they're engaged. Hopefully, they're engaged, but
Mm-hmm.
they're also challenged to some
Mm-hmm.
extent. They're using some cognitive effort. But if kids are watching a YouTube video or they're playing a simple game, that's rote activity. They're engaged with it, but they're not really putting in a lot of mental effort. Um, Adults use rote activity all the time. People play Candy Crush, or people play simple crossword puzzles or anagram games. People knit.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I mean, there's all kinds of activities that are rote that people do quite often.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we all know when we've reached like that point where we're like, oh, I just need to tune out or do something that takes my mind off of all the stressful things. For me, it's looking at Redfin and just browsing homes. Like that's my thing that
Mhm.
I do when I'm like, I'm
Yeah.
overwhelmed and I need a break. And you share that people feel happiest when they're doing rote activities and that you can become bound to the rote activity. And you wrote, this is why people spend so many hours watching TikToks, because rote activities feel good, but can they become a problem?
They can become a problem, of course, if we're not careful at limiting the amount of time that we spend doing them. And that's, I mean, you point out that's exactly the problem. They make us happy.
Mm-hmm.
Why do they make us happy? Because they're easy,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're engaging. They capture our interest. We get rewards. You watch a TikTok video and you get a reward because every so often you find this video that's just, hilarious. It makes you feel good, makes you laugh.
Mm-hmm.
People play games because they earn points, they get to higher levels. So it makes them feel good. Lots
Mm-hmm.
of reasons. But it's problematic when we don't have the self control to stop doing these kinds of activities
Mm-hmm.
when we have other things that we need to get done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a parent and you have to take care of your kids, you don't want to be playing Candy Crush. It's just not
Mm-hmm.
it's not healthy for you. It's not healthy for your kids.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, it's two-sided. We enjoy these activities, but we become glued to them
Mm-hmm.
and it's hard to get away.
Right. And it was interesting how you described we actually get intermittent reinforcement or intermittent rewards from these activities. So, like in my example of looking at homes on Redfin, most of the homes I'm not super excited about, but once in a while I'll find that home where I'm like, oh, it's the right price and the right amount of land and it
Yeah.
looks beautiful and I get that reward. Can you explain to listeners about how intermittent reinforcement works for for maybe for adolescents and what they're doing on social media?
Yeah. So intermittent reinforcement is when you're reinforced, you're rewarded, some kind of reward,
Mm-hmm.
and it happens on a random basis. So it doesn't happen every single time.
Mm-hmm.
So you've probably heard the experiment of the cat who presses the lever. Every time they press the lever, they get a reward of
Mm-hmm.
a food pellet. Uh, Intermittent reinforcement doesn't work that way. It's just that you get a reward every so often and you can't predict when you're going to get that reward.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem with intermittent reinforcement is that it's the hardest behavior to extinguish. And extinguish simply means to stop it,
Mm-hmm.
to pull away from it.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because, if we're rewarded every single time, like let's say every single TikTok video is fantastic. And so, of course, you want to keep staying there to see it. And then all of a sudden, they start becoming boring, right? People will stop because they learn very quickly that, okay, these rewards have stopped,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if it happens randomly, you're sticking to that because at some point that reward is going to happen. It's like playing a slot machine in
Mm-hmm.
Las Vegas. Every time you pull the lever, you don't get a reward, but you keep, there's anticipation that at some point you're going to get that reward. And so you keep playing that slot machine because at some point that reward will come.
Mm-hmm. And I think a neuroscientist once told me about how that dopamine hit works when it's actually right before you do the activity. So the
That's right.
anticipation, right?
That's
Okay.
exactly right.
Yeah.
It's not given to you after you do the activity,
Mm-hmm.
but the anticipation of getting a reward
Mm-hmm.
creates that dopamine surge.
Mm-hmm. And I'm fascinated by, our adolescents' use of social media. And when we talk about them using it as a rote activity, which makes them happy, but it's actually so the things that they're interacting with the most and that keep them on the platform is the shocking content, something violent, something inappropriate. And Mark Zuckerberg once said something like, "The closer a post comes to breaking our terms of service, the more engagement that it gets, and the more it keeps kids on the platform." Do you have an understanding of what is it about that harmful or shocking content and the
Yeah.
reaction that it gets from adolescents that keeps them on the platforms?
Yeah, it appeals to very basic emotions that people have. I mean, people have very basic emotions like happiness and sadness and surprise and anger
Mm-hmm.
and anything that appeals to those very basic emotions, right? It captures our attention. And in fact, Facebook uh, at one point was manipulating the feeds that people would get so that feeds that created anger would be more likely sent to people because it knew that when people were angry, they would get engaged
Mm-hmm.
with with the content. So yeah, having shock value, uh, social media companies know that it's going to keep people's attention
Mm-hmm.
because it creates this kind of surprise and anger.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and it feeds off of their adolescent brains and keeping them engaged through these emotions, right?
Hmm.
Do you have any advice for parents on how we can help our kids access these platforms and, even rote activities that makes them feel happy when needed, but keep constraints because they're faced with these platforms that are now built to addict them? So, guidance for parents on how to help our kids in this way.
Yeah. So the important thing is to replace these activities with other things that are meaningful for children.
Okay.
One of the most meaningful replacements is getting kids outside
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
getting them moving around, getting them to play sports,
Mm-hmm.
uh, getting them to socialize with other children is also a great replacement.
Mm-hmm.
And socializing with other children doesn't mean two kids looking at a screen
Mm-hmm.
and playing a game. It really means, doing something with each other,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that's not using smartphones or screens.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's the the best advice I can give is to think about replacement and to not let children get into a habit that as soon as you're bored or as soon as you procrastinate, you pick up the smartphone
Mm-hmm.
or you go to a video game. That's not what we want kids to uh, get accustomed to doing because once you get into that habit, it becomes very hard
Mm-hmm.
to break it. So let's try to avoid that habit in the first place. Um, my kids grew up before the internet really took off. I mean, they they did grow up with the internet, but when they were very young, it was before the internet was widely popular.
Mm-hmm.
And but everyone was watching TV,
Mm-hmm.
right? Kids were glued to the TV set. And we raised our kids without TV.
Mm.
And I needed a replacement. And so I would go to the library and I would get them books.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, they became really engrossed in books and developed a love for books. And then I remember one time when we were on sabbatical, we were living in Berlin and we had a flat that we rented that had two TVs.
Mm-hmm.
And my kids were, you know, bugging me and I needed to work. And without thinking, I just said, "Oh, go watch TV."
Mm-hmm.
And they protested and they said, "No, it's boring."
Oh my gosh.
And so that was a wake-up call for me that, I needed to do some other activity with them
Mm-hmm.
other than TV. The other thing I would say is giving our kids attention, right? Because it's very easy to just simply hand kids a, a simple game to do, right? Which is what I did when my kids were bugging me, and I said, "Oh, go watch TV."
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's hard being a parent. I get it.
Mm-hmm.
I understand, but we have to think about giving our kids attention because it's really our attention that they crave. And if we try to simply push them onto a game so that it kind of frees us up and gives us a moment of respite and we can breathe,
Mm-hmm.
well, Yeah, I mean, it's good for us. It may not be good for the kids. And in the long run, it's probably not going to be good for us either
Mm-hmm.
because we're creating habits. So it's about being more conscious
Mm-hmm.
of where we're directing our children's attention.
Yeah.
Now, if if children are doing some game, and there are educational games, right? And those are okay. It's good to set limits. And it's good to say, okay, you've got 30 minutes of screen time today. Use it
Mm-hmm.
however you want. Make a
Mm-hmm.
choice. And they can play a game, they can watch a video, but that's their limit. And you
Mm-hmm.
set the ground rules, and that's it.
Yeah. I like to remind parents when we're talking about screen time limits to make sure they're adding in and considering the screen time that they're getting at school, because that's
Oh, yeah.
often many hours. And for
Mm-hmm.
our family, I know they're getting 1 to 2 hours at minimum at school of screen time. So we also don't do TV or screens at home until we're all together as a family and deciding to watch a movie together. Most evenings we watch about an hour of a movie, but it's a group activity and it's all together. And my husband and I don't have our phones with us. So it's a very much interactive experience. Um, and you touched on a lot of things there. And this theme of it being, yeah, parenting is hard and it may seem easy to hand the kid a screen in those moments where they're bored or, you need some time to get dinner done or whatever. That may seem like the easier option. But what they need is that face-to-face interaction that you mentioned in order for their brains to develop. And you're really blocking that brain development, social development, language development by handing them the screen again and again. So,
That's right. The way to think about it is that there's an opportunity cost, right?
mm-hmm,
There is just a finite amount of time during the day.
right.
And if children are doing one thing, there's an opportunity cost that they're not doing something else.
Mm-hmm,
And so we need to think about what's the healthiest activity
mm-hmm,
for children to be doing. I love the idea that you watch screens together as a family.
mm-hmm,
That's really great because first of all, you can control the content that children are watching, which is really important.
mm-hmm,
And secondly, you can discuss it
mm-hmm.
and it becomes a teaching moment for children.
Yeah.
So if you're all watching a movie together, you can discuss it. You can discuss it while it's playing. You can discuss it afterwards.
Mm-hmm,
But you've created a shared experience
mm-hmm,
for the family, and that's just really great. When our kids were raised without TV, we did watch films,
mm-hmm.
and we controlled the films that the kids would see,
Yeah.
and we did watch the films as a family most of the time. Most of the time, sometimes the children watched films on their own, but I felt like we gave them a film education,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we really chose good films for them to watch, and I have to say, one of my daughters now is studying filmmaking,
Oh, wow.
and
Yeah.
maybe it's tied to that.
Mm-hmm. I would bet so. So I don't know that a lot of families sit and watch them together where they can really analyze the story and ask those questions in real time. And I think that's important to do as a family. Um, and one stat that came to mind about face-to-face interaction is that young boys are only spending about 30 minutes a week of face-to-face interaction with their fathers. And that
Wow.
was startling. And I think 20 hours a week on screens minimum versus 30 minutes a week with, we've gone a little too far with relying on
Yeah,
the screens.
yeah, that's a shocking statistic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to transition to talk about algorithms because you talked about in the book, and I think you had some great insight. And we talked about we talked about kids getting served harmful content, and it keeps them on these platforms where they're spending a lot of time, specifically social media platforms. And you've studied how algorithms work. Can you explain to listeners how they really work to keep our attention?
Yep. So every time we go on the web, we leave digital traces
Mm-hmm.
of our behaviors, patterns of our behaviors. So you go to a shopping site and you browse what's on the shopping site, or you go to social media and you click like for certain kinds of posts.
Mm-hmm.
All of that information is collected by tech companies and ad companies, and it's used to create a profile about us,
Mm-hmm.
to understand what it is that we like. And then these profiles are used to gear content toward us, content with ads, with notifications. And so because it's geared to what our personality might be like, to the content that we like, there's a pretty good chance that we might click on it, right? So an example is, if I'm an introvert, I might be shown an ad of a person sitting on the couch reading a book, and maybe it's advertising some kind of soft drink,
Mm-hmm.
right? I might be more likely to click on that. If I'm an extrovert, I might be more likely to click on an ad that shows people partying, lots of people in the room,
Mm-hmm.
everybody's holding this soft drink, right? So that's an example of how content is geared toward us, that kind of taps into just our basic natures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's surprising how much information and how accurate uh, these algorithms are in targeting our interests. And so
Mm-hmm.
there are lots of studies that show that they're pretty accurate at detecting our personalities
Mm-hmm.
and basic kinds of things that we like. Uh, the TikTok algorithm is very powerful. It's very, very powerful. The more that people use TikTok, the more this algorithm learns about the kinds of videos that people like, and the better able it is to serve videos to people that they're most likely to continue liking. And it takes so much information into account. It takes the features of what's in the video, takes aspects of people, what they clicked on prior,
Mm-hmm.
uh, looks at context like time of day. So there's so many things, and that's why TikTok is, it's a real attention killer
Mm-hmm.
for young people especially.
Mm-hmm. I think it's TikTok, the one where if you don't opt out, so by default, it actually tracks your activities across all your devices, not just the one where the app is downloaded to. So you have your Apple ID kind of connected to everything, your MacBook computer, your laptop, or your iPad. It's actually getting data from all of those devices, which is why I won't download it to my phone. um, so when we talk about algorithms and how much they're taking into account and serving us content to interact with, you talk about free will related to this, and how much of our actions on our phones and social media, like how much would you consider of our own free will versus sort of unconscious actions that are being guided by the technology?
Yeah. So there is a distinction here. We do a lot of things unconsciously. So you see a notification without thinking, we click on it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I talked about how these algorithms are geared toward our most basic emotions,
Yeah.
right? Through notifications, we just instinctively click on them. We also do things that we're not aware of, like grabbing my cell phone and clicking on it. I see it and I grab it
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
swipe it open. That's another example of unconscious kinds of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Now, an extreme version of free will would be that everything we do on the internet is controlled by algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that people do have agency, certainly the capacity to develop their own agency.
Mm-hmm.
But some actions, yeah, some actions are unconscious, that sort of not we're not aware necessarily of things that we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that I talk about this idea of soft determinism. What
Mm-hmm.
that means is that within a particular environment and circumstances, people have free will for how they can act. So a person who's born into poverty probably has less opportunities than someone who's born into a very wealthy family,
Mm-hmm.
but they still have free will to make choices, right? It's just that they have constraints based on the circumstances of their birth and upbringing and
Mm-hmm.
neighborhood and so on. And so if you think about that in terms of our digital environments,
Mm-hmm.
the constraints we have is that we're surrounded by devices. We've got our computers, tablets, smartphones. When we go to any kind of public place, everyone has their smartphones out.
Mm-hmm.
This exerts peer pressure on us. So there's so many influences that shape us. And within this kind of circumstance of being surrounded by digital devices,
Mm-hmm.
right, it does impose a constraint and it kind of pushes us to, check our phones. If you're in a group and 9 people have their phones out, then
Mm-hmm.
you might just pull out your phone as well. So
Mm-hmm.
we're very much shaped by our circumstances, but yet within those, I believe that people have free will for how they can act.
Okay, that's good to hear. I'm going to cough really quick. Hold on a second. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to touch on, you mentioned that the algorithms are very accurate, but I wanted to point out that they're imperfect. So there's examples of algorithms, I would say, going wrong. Like, for example, pedophiles who interact on Instagram with the content of pedophilic nature then get served more pedophilic content by the algorithm. And there's legislation and bills proposed to turn off the algorithm for minors due to the addictive nature of the platforms and the negative effect that this has on their developing brains. Would you agree that that would be beneficial to youth and to minors to not have that algorithm feeding them content?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Because it's not fair that tech companies be the ones that decide what content we look at. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it really should be parents and teachers and school systems that make those decisions. But that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. When children use social media, the content they're seeing is, it's fed to them
Mm-hmm.
based on an algorithm. And I talked about the TikTok algorithm as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, kids are fed algorithms to keep them glued to the screen, right? That's the intent.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just kids, it's adults too,
Mm-hmm.
because the more time we spend on social media, the more ads we'll be exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
And the more ads we'll be exposed to, the more we're likely to buy them. So, yeah, absolutely. I do not think that tech companies should have the power to determine what content our children see or the content we see.
Right. And we've already discussed that because they are promoting in the algorithm harmful content and shocking content, because that keeps the kids on there longer, and they're not worried generally about the kids' mental health. They're worried about the profit, which they load their pockets by keeping those kids on there as long as possible to see more ads. So it's kind of a
Yeah.
loop that doesn't benefit our kids. So okay, I want to transition to multitasking because this is something that I'm really interested in. I deal with it in my household. But so smartphones and personal computers, all these devices have allowed us to sort of try to be constantly multitasking, like listening to music while we're working, even subtle things like that, or talking on a conference call, but also emailing. And so generally, like, what have you learned about multitasking that would be helpful for parents? Like, is it good? Is it bad? Should we be multitasking? Anything you can share?
Yeah, it's bad. That's the bottom line. And
Yeah.
there's three reasons why.
Okay.
So, but first, let me say that the public narrative is that we should push ourselves to multitask, that we can
Mm-hmm.
do more if we multitask.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a myth, right? And there's three reasons why it's bad. So first of all, if you're multitasking, it takes you longer to do any one thing. So if you've got, you're doing one task and then you're switching between that and two or three other things, to do any of those things requires more time when you multitask than if you were just to work on them sequentially, one right after the other. There's a switch cost. And the way to think about that is uh, think of it as having a whiteboard in your mind, an internal whiteboard. And whenever we work on a task, we have all the information we need for that task written on that whiteboard. And then we suddenly switch. We do something else. We're erasing that whiteboard and rewriting new information and erasing and rewriting every time we switch tasks. And that takes time and effort, and it's draining to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Second reason is that people make more errors when they multitask. So if you're on a Zoom meeting and you're trying to do your email and you're switching back and forth, your chances are you're not doing either one very well, because you want to pay attention to the Zoom meeting, but you want to do your email, and then someone calls on you during the meeting and you haven't been listening, right?
Right.
But we also know from lots of psychological laboratory experiments that people make lots of errors when they try to do multiple things.
Okay.
Imagine you're cooking and you're trying to do texting and you're trying to do something else at the same time. There's a higher chance you're going to make a mistake for one of those things. And the third reason, for me, this is the worst of all, is it creates stress. And we do know that when people multitask, it causes stress to increase. We know this from lots of psychology experiments. We know that blood pressure rises when people are multitasking. From my own research, we've had people wear heart rate monitors and we watch what they're doing. We can see when they're switching their attention on their screens and phones, and we see stress going up at the exact times that they're switching their attention. So, yeah, it takes longer, people make more errors, and it creates stress. So it's not a good thing.
No. And I mean, the visual that came to me was like, if I'm trying to parent and I don't have help and I'm working and I need to get this email done and my kids are screaming in the background, that is when I bubble over. Those have been the moments where I cannot handle that level of stress and I yell or do something that is not in my character.
Yes, absolutely. And we've all been there.
Yeah.
Right? Every parent has experienced that. And, we should try to recognize that, let's do one thing at a time. And if your children need attention, let's give them the attention. Yes. Let's spend some time, figure out what we can do to occupy their minds, that to give them something interesting to do. Then we can go back to do our work.
Right. So I talked to a few college professors and high school teachers recently. I'm doing a series trying to learn about how technology in the classroom is affecting students' learning. And some of especially the college professors, they struggle a lot because kids will have a headphone in during class. And some of the teachers are allowing it because they feel that the student is able to better focus when they have one headphone in and music is playing. I wonder what your thoughts are on this type of multitasking.
Yeah, so when I have taught, I do not allow children to wear headphones. Now, I would like to not allow them to use computers, but the students always protest and say, "Oh, but we're taking notes." But of course, when you see them all of a sudden cracking up, they're not taking notes; they're texting or playing a game or something. But no, I don't believe that it's beneficial for students to wear headphones when they're listening to music. Some music might be soothing, but imagine listening to music with lyrics.
Right.
That can be very distracting.
Right.
So I don't know. I'm not in favor of doing that.
Okay. Agree. I hear lots of these stories where my kid can listen to a book on tape and also be like reading something else. And it's like, but they're not getting the most out of it. They're
Yeah.
not absorbing this. And I think this
They're
is,
they're e-
sorry.
that they're either listening to the book on tape or they're reading the physical book, but they're not doing both.
Right. No. Okay. The brain doesn't work like that.
Hmm.
Okay. This is applicable for parents too, in the way that we, maybe listening to a podcast in the background while we're emailing. And I think that we need to set the example too for our kids that we don't have to have multiple things going on at all times.
Right.
Okay. So I wanted to talk about separately that everything that we do now is in bite-sized lengths. Everything we see is getting shorter and shorter. Social media videos are 60 or 90 seconds. The ad you mentioned in your book, the ads are shorter. And when I edit videos to promote this podcast, I use jump cuts. So I have to clip out every breath, every pause. Otherwise, I know people will scroll past it. So you also see this in comments on social media that are a paragraph. Someone will say TLDR, like too long, don't read, like can't read. Like they won't even read long comments. So what are your thoughts on this abbreviating of everything in our culture and how it's affecting people's attention spans, or any other effects that you've noticed related to this?
Yeah, I mean you're absolutely right, and I wrote about that in the book,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm very concerned with it. Um, so social media constrains the content length,
Mm-hmm.
that people are writing less, uh, the videos are shorter because that's what is believed to attract attention.
Mm-hmm.
But as a result, we keep shifting our attention, and it's reinforcing our already short attention spans,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we're not getting the experience to watch longer uh, things.
Mm-hmm.
And I also talk about how film and movie shot lengths have also shortened in length. When film and TV first started out, the shot lengths were much longer. Now they're down to an average of about 4 seconds.
Oh, wow.
And if you watch a blockbuster film, they're probably more like every 2 seconds.
Oh,
The 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 shot length, the
wow.
shot
Mm-hmm.
is switching.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like you're in a pinball machine and your mind is just being bounced around everywhere. But people have become accustomed to that
Mm-hmm.
because it keeps our adrenaline up,
Mm-hmm.
right? It keeps us very aroused, and we're, paying attention, but we're not necessarily comprehending what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's keeping us on the screen, but we may not be able to make sense of
Mm-hmm.
what's on that screen. So I just think it's a really bad trajectory for content to get shorter, for you know videos to get shorter. It's creating expectations, and it's creating habits that are very hard to break.
Mm-hmm. So, what would you forecast the future looks like around this? So, are things just going to keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter, or do you feel like you're seeing an increase in awareness of how, like, this short attention economy is affecting us negatively?
Yeah. I mean, I am optimistic. I am seeing an increase in awareness. It's hard to predict
Mm-hmm.
if things will get shorter, because we might already be at the nadir, the lowest point that we can be at, especially, shot lengths changing every 2, 3 seconds, four
Mm-hmm.
seconds.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think we can get much shorter than that.
Right.
And 47 seconds of attention on a screen, yeah, it's possible our attention might get shorter than that.
Mm-hmm.
I hope not, and I don't know how much shorter it can possibly get. But we reach a point where we just can't comprehend things anymore
Mm-hmm.
when our attention spans become too short. So I'm hoping that this awareness, a lot of people are starting to realize what's happening with media, and even off media, people are reporting short attention spans.
Mm.
And so, I'm just hoping that this will kind of reset
Yeah.
the way that we use media.
Yeah. And I think parents are seeing the effects on their kids and starting earlier and earlier to let their kids be bored, let them figure out what they're going to do, these things to help their brain develop in order to retain more and just be more creative and less focused on these short, bite-sized digital experiences.
Yeah, there's research that's done with very small children
Mm,
where they expose them to fast-paced videos.
mm,
So there was one set of children, they were brought into a laboratory, they watched very fast-paced videos,
mm-hmm,
and then the other set of children did something like drawing or
mm-hmm,
painting. And then afterwards, they measured their attention. And the children who were exposed to the fast-paced videos had a harder time paying attention.
mm.
Their attention spans were shorter than the kids who were drawing and painting.
Sure.
So we know that this has a causal effect on
Mm-hmm.
our attention.
And that could have, if every day you're choosing for your child the fast-paced digital option, we know that the ramifications of that long term, that doesn't set them up for success when in schooling or maintaining a job or even a relationship, um, so you've shared so much good so much advice for parents throughout this, but let's wrap up with, like, how can parents help our kids better achieve focus and better balance? So maybe a few tips, any other tips you would give to parents related to attention and focus?
Yeah. So I talked about the idea of replacing
Mm-hmm.
screen activity with something else.
Mm-hmm.
The best possible thing for children and for adults
Mm-hmm.
is to be outside. And it turns out that just 20 minutes in nature
Mm-hmm.
can really restore us. And this might be good advice for parents when you're really stressed. You know, just go out and spend time in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been shown that people become de-stressed, and there's just something about, I guess there's so much stimuli out in nature, and it's
Mm-hmm.
natural, and it just appeals to us in some way that it causes our stress to go down.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say for kids, get them out in nature
Mm-hmm.
every day. Now, you and I live in Southern California. It's easy for us to say that.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Ohio with blizzards,
Mm-hmm.
and I was outside
Yeah. Yeah.
playing in the snow. It's possible.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, but it's just really important. I would also say limit screen time.
Mm-hmm.
So really set firm limits. No screen time at all for kids that are 2 years of age and younger.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely none. And beyond that, set very strict limits. I love that what you do with your family,
Mm-hmm.
where everybody sits in the same room and watches uh, watches a film or TV. That's great,
Mm-hmm.
right? Turning this into a social activity
Mm-hmm.
is just wonderful. I would say when kids are on screens, try to give them educational content
Mm-hmm.
to the extent that you can, but be careful because a lot of sites claim to be educational, but they're really not,
Mm-hmm.
right? So make make sure about that.
Yeah.
You can
Even
also,
YouTube Kids, I'll mention YouTube Kids, which you would think is pretty educational, but I think a study showed only 4% of videos on YouTube Kids would be considered educational. So we just have to keep that in mind.
yeah,
Yeah.
be very, very careful with that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can form a contract with
Mm-hmm.
your kids.
Yeah.
So you sit down with them you form a contract. There's probably going to be negotiation because kids
Mhm.
are kids.
Yep.
They like to negotiate.
Mhm.
But you form a contract and you stick to that contract, and that contract includes the screen limits, and it also includes things like content,
Mhm.
what they can uh, look at,
Mhm.
and time for socializing, play dates, being outside
Mhm.
also should be put into that
Mhm.
contract. And other things too that parents feel are important for kids. Now, at a societal level, we need legislation
Yep.
that, as you said, can stop tech companies from using algorithms to feed content to children.
Mhm.
But also, I think that we need media literacy programs in
Mhm.
schools.
Yep.
Now, there are some media literacy programs, but they're not they're limited.
Mhm.
And I think we need to think about them more expansively in
Mhm.
terms of limiting the amount of time that you spend on a screen, especially outside of school,
Mhm.
and making children aware of pitfalls,
Mhm.
that there can be misinformation and disinformation, and making kids savvy
Mhm.
to things that they encounter online, make them aware that cyberbullying can happen and who they should go to, they should talk about it with.
Mhm.
So there's really a need for media literacy programs to
Mhm.
educate kids. And I'm so shocked that this isn't part of the school curriculum, right? Because the internet is so much a part of our lives.
Mhm.
And, I saw a statistic that teens spent about 9 hours a day on some kind of screen,
Mhm.
some kind of screen.
Yeah.
Why aren't we thinking about teaching kids
Mhm.
proper behavior when they're using screens? It's
Mhm.
just, to me, it seems so natural. We should be
Right.
doing this.
I think the schools that are teaching some media literacy, for example, my children's schools say they do have a couple sessions in the beginning of the year, one in the end of the year. But I feel like the parents aren't really in the know. Like there needs to be more of a joint effort between schools and parents where kids are spending all of their time. We need to be working in tandem. And that takes educating parents as well on the same things that the kids are learning in class so we can reiterate that information and have a consistent approach in our own homes because the kids are going to get access to something in one place or another. And so it's, I think, benefits everybody if we're all on the same page. And that's, again, why I'm interviewing a lot of teachers to try to kind of bridge the gap between parents and teachers and have us help each other instead of fighting each other on these things.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And just having teaching media literacy, at the beginning and
Mm-hmm.
end of each year or each semester is
Yeah,
not enough. It
agree.
has to be ongoing,
Yep.
and it is very important for parents to also be discussing this, that what they're learning in these
Mm-hmm.
literacy programs, because the parents are a part of this, right? We
Mm-hmm.
can't separate it because kids are watching, uh, they're using their phones and tablets and computers outside of school.
Yep.
So it's so important, and it can make a difference, right? Public campaigns and what kids are taught in school
Mm-hmm.
can absolutely make a difference in our
Mm-hmm.
lives.
And it could be life or death. I mean, the suicide rates for teenagers are skyrocketing, especially with
Yeah.
young females, and just the depression rates. And so, just having these conversations is a first step and is really important and can, yeah, you're right, can make a difference. And
Yes.
okay, so I'm going to start to close this out. And Dr. Mark, thank you so much for everything that you do, for sharing, for doing this work and educating parents on our kids' attention spans, our own attention spans, and how we can, help our kids and guide them through this time where everything's bite-sized. So, and then to the listeners, thank you for educating yourselves on topics like this. We're parenting through an unknown time in a digital world that's turning out to be harmful for our children. And so together we can continue to explore how we got here and how we can start to do things a little bit better. So thank you everyone for listening. And Dr. Mark, again, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.